Hello and welcome to our COVID-19 Economic Webinar 3. This is Aisha Salman, BI Analyst for the American Supply Association. The COVID-19 outbreak has sparked urgent questions about the impact of pandemics on the real economy. Policymakers are in uncharted territory with little guidance on what the expected economic fallout will be and how the crisis should be managed. The World Health Organization is still trying to figure out what the real economic effects of a pandemic and are these effects temporary or persistent? Second, how does the local public health response affect the economic severity of the pandemic? In particular, do non-pharmaceutical interventions such as social distancing have economic costs, or do policies that slow the spread of the pandemic also reduce its economic severity? New York, New Jersey, and Michigan are some of the states that are devastated by this pandemic. In particular, our ASA members that belong to these states are hurting. If and when the country starts opening up, how soon will these states start rising from the ashes? We are at 17 million unemployment claims as of this week, and the virus-related deaths have crossed 26,000 in the U.S. alone. President Trump and the World Health Organization seems to be at odds with each other, and their funding has been halted. There are talks of social distancing measures continuing to 2022. The IMF has published its flagship report on World Economic Outlook on the situation, and in the report it is projected that the global economy is projected to contract sharply by 3% later this year. This report also highlighted that this year the global economy will experience its worst recession since the Great Depression, surpassing that seen during the global financial crisis a decade ago. The Great Lockdown is projected to shrink global growth dramatically. It said adding the output low associated with the health emergency and related containment measures likely dwarfs the losses that triggered the 2008-2009 crash. Our ASA chief economist, Dr. Kuehl, has mentioned previously that we most likely are somewhere between the good and the bad scenario, meaning we may report a decline for a couple of quarters, but once the economy starts to pick up, recovery would be quick, as it is more of an event-related recession. In today's webinar, Recovery in Sight or Settling in for a Siege, Dr. Kuehl will examine if this still remains to be the case or if we are headed for something worse, and what is in store in the coming days. Just a quick intro to him. He has a doctorate in political economics and advanced degrees in Soviet and Asian studies, and is also a co-founder of the Armada Corporate Intelligence. He is a chief economist for a number of associations, including ours. He is also the chief editor for the Business Intelligence Brief and is one of the primary writers of the Black Owl Report. The webinar will last 40 to 45 minutes, and we will open the floor for questions and answers in the end. Please post your answers in the question box on the GoToWebinar window towards the bottom. We will try to get to as many questions as possible today. I will be sending another satisfaction survey your way after, and we would like to know from you if we should conduct another webinar with Dr. Kuehl in a few weeks. Please take the survey to let us know your response. Over to you, Chris.
Thank you very much. And welcome to Volume 3 of this exciting series. I think by now, most of you would rather be watching The Bachelor or, almost anything other than these seminars. And one of the things that will be a signal that we have recovered is that you will no longer be hearing from every week. So that now becomes our new marker. So, all right, I need to get control of here we go. All right, here we go. So the black swan maybe is beginning to swim, at least starting to look like it wants to take off. So what we're going to talk about today is a little bit about where we are, but also a little bit about what happens from here. You're already hearing a lot of conversation about what happens when we emerge from what's now being referred to as the lockdown recession. Almost every comparison that you're hearing right now to the Great Depression or the Depression of 2008 or what happened in the 1980s, none of those really help very much in terms of understanding where we are right now. This is a very different kind of recession. It is going to proceed very differently. It is going to end very differently, and it's going to leave a much more interesting, substantial impact on the global economy because it's not something we have any experience with. This is an imposed recession. We have never had anything that comes close to this. It was a recession that was completely unexpected. It happened literally in a day. As soon as the government began to shut things down, you were facing a recession. Every other recession takes months, if not years, to build up. It sends warning signals. You know that it's coming. You have these booms that you know have to end. If you go back to 2007, you saw the economy out of control. Housing prices were ridiculous. People were talking about it for months. So when it finally arrived, it didn't really shock anybody. This time it was like, well, at 8 o'clock in the morning, it was a good economy. We were growing at 2%. The unemployment rate was as low as it had been in 40 years. At 8:05, the economy collapsed. It's like, what? How was anyone supposed to be prepared for any of that? So getting back to normal is going to be a little bit of a return to previous attitudes, kind of getting over the shock of the system. And we'll talk a little bit about how that will play out. So in general, the COVID-19 impact has been predictable in a way. I mean, we knew what was likely to happen once the shutdown was imposed. Affected businesses would cease to operate, which would mean immediate job loss and unemployment. There would be major pay cuts. Business debt would mount. GDP growth would shrink. Investment would be crippled. The stock market plunged. The weird thing about this is that even though we knew that this was going to be the outcome, there wasn't a lot of hesitation when it came to imposing the lockdown. This was something seen as necessary, as required given the emergency. One of the concerns going forward is that, was that a correct assumption? Is this something where the cure was worse than the disease? And there's going to be a lot of rethinking about what happens next. This is certainly not the kind of response we want to engage in every year. So if we are to expect more viral attacks, which we should, I mean, they've been happening for decades, we're going to have a whole different system because we surely do not want a new pattern. Every year, we're going to shut the economy down for 2 months. How will that work for you, everybody? Every 10 months, all your businesses shut down, all your employees are fired. Yeah, we won't survive that. And as a result, that can't be an option for a year. So if you look where the impact has been felt most acutely, again, there's no big surprise here, declining consumption, and that you can't overstate how important consumption is in the United States. This is a consumer-driven economy. 80% of the GDP is connected to consumption. Almost 80% of jobs are connected to consumption. And if you look at the data that's been rolling out this week, an 8% drop in retail sales in 1 month, that has almost never happened. I mean, usually we're looking at, there was a 1% change in retail sales. There was a 1.2, and we get very excited. I mean, oh my God, there's a 2%, 8%. That just never happens. And it really decks the U.S. economy when that happens. It decks everybody's economy, but ours probably a little more significantly than others. Serious decline in investment, lots of uncertainty. The markets have been bouncing around a lot. They plunged like crazy in the beginning, have kind of made periodic comebacks, but they're nowhere near where they were before. Lots more government expenditure, and this is something that is unlikely to change. One of the warnings that have been issued by economists for years and ignored for years is that we were running too high a deficit and running too high a debt. There was a point at which, not that many years ago, that there seemed to be people in Congress that were worried about this. Remember the Tea Party guys who were very concerned about the size of our debt and deficit? Apparently, they were all kidnapped and sent to Greenland because there's been no discussion about it since. And the warning always was that if you hit a major emergency like this one, you have no money in reserve. you are going to have to borrow every single dime you need to deal with the emergency, and that's exactly what we're doing now. This $2.2 trillion contribution to the economy is a rescue. All of that is borrowed money, every single dollar. There is absolutely no budget surplus to work with, so this has been necessitating another massive sale of government bonds. Our debt service just jumped again, and it's already very high. We'll talk about that a little bit later. We've seen a decline in net exports, and that's something that's likely to extend, if for no other reason that the countries that we sell to are in exactly the same shape we're in. They're all suffering as well, so they don't have any money to buy what we have to sell. If you look at the numbers thus far, and there's been a certain amount of controversy over numbers because, well, those of you who've heard my talks before know that I'm fond of quoting a very old but very interesting book called How to Lie with Statistics. This was written back in the 1940s. It used to be what I taught out of when I was teaching statistics because none of the students wanted to be there. So I'd look at them and say, okay, I know you hate this. I know this is the class you've been avoiding since you got into college. But understand this. If you understand statistics, you will, one, know how to lie to other people in a way that they will believe. Number two, if you don't feel like being dishonest, you will know when somebody is lying to you because you will be able to look at their statistics and say, oh, wait a minute, that's not right. You're not using mean, median, or mode correctly. You don't have enough degrees of freedom, blah, blah, blah. So the numbers have been questionable in some cases. There was a lot of concern early on with what China was producing because China was effectively trying to cover this up, trying to buy, and they knew things were going on last year and didn't respond. I mean, Wuhan was doing its best to hide what was happening from its own government, much less the rest of the world. The data that's coming out of China now is a lot more reliable because China is now overrun with public health officials from all over the world. You've got the CDC is there, the Japanese Ministry of Health is there, the European Health Ministry is there, the WHO there, everybody is there. And there's little or nothing the Chinese can do to hide the realities. So the numbers now are a lot more reliable. But even in the United States, where we're doing as good a job as we can collecting data, classification matters. What somebody was determined to have died from. For a long time, we didn't really know whether people were dying from COVID-19 or some other respiratory illness because the others didn't just go away. I mean, it wasn't like the flu said, oh, well, it's COVID-19's turn, so we're not going to kill anybody this year, so it's their turn. Well, no, the flu is still killing people. Upper respiratory ailments of varying kinds are still killing people. We still have people dying of SARS and MERS and bird flu and avian. I mean, all of these are active. They're not killing in the numbers that COVID-19 has, but sometimes it's hard to tell. Somebody is dying of a pneumonic infection and their lungs have shut down. Exactly why? Was it COVID, the flu? Was it SARS? Was it something else? So the data thus far is telling us that we have about 1,876,000 cases worldwide. There have been 116,000 roughly deaths worldwide. An important statistic which continues to hold up is that 96% of the cases are judged to be minor, no hospitalization. People have not been required to go into extensive treatment. There is still a much higher rate of hospitalization for COVID-19 there is for even the more serious cases of seasonal flu. But you still have a situation where it's about 6%, roughly 4 to 5% of people who are being hospitalized. In the U.S. alone, 22,000 plus deaths. That's 67 deaths per million. To put that in perspective, in Spain, it's been 374 per million. Serious condition, around 12,000. There have been about 3 million tests thus far. That's about 8,000 tests per million. The highest level of testing has probably been South Korea, Germany, Sweden, perhaps. They're about twice the number of tests per million than we have been able to pull off so far. There are 33,000 recoveries, roughly 507,000 active cases. But as Aisha pointed out in the beginning, 16 million people out of work as of a week ago. So we're dealing with a really serious economic issue to deal with a serious medical issue. And that will lead to a conversation here in a moment. So personal expenditures, this is a change in how people spend their money. And you can tell that this was basically broken down between people who've lost their jobs, people who've exhausted their unemployment insurance, and who've exhausted their unemployment and haven't gotten a job. All of the declines are significant. I mean, for people who have gone through their unemployment, it's been a collapse of 20%, 19%, 24%. The only thing where they have been seeing more spending and at the same time more pressure on their budget has been in medical and insurance, debt payments. People are behind in their loans, behind in credit cards. This is a cascade effect of people having lost their jobs, and this doesn't really reverse until people are somehow back to work. The growth of the infection has begun to flatten. It has definitely flattened in Asia. It is now starting to flatten in Europe, which is why the Europeans and the Asians are fully into the conversation of how do we come out of this and what do we reopen and how do we reopen, which we'll talk about in a moment. Global trade impact is still playing itself out. The most pessimistic scenario has it dropping by a very significant level, getting down to levels we've not seen in decades. More optimistic assessment is a temporary blip, and that's going to be a common theme. How long does this last? If we are out of it to a significant degree in May, and there is still an awful lot of conversation that would be the pattern, this becomes a one-quarter recession and may not even a full-blown recession. If we get a recovery in May, we will see probably a decline of between 1.6 and 1.7% in the GDP as compared to what it was last year. That takes us very, very low. It takes us to like a 0.04% growth, but it's not recession. And by the end of the second quarter, you would be seeing a little bit of progress. So the third quarter would unlikely hit those recessionary numbers. Job market woes, again, no big surprise. I just threw this in there so we can say, wow, this is the worst it's ever been. Well, of course it is. We've had very stable employment for 20, 30, 40 years, and now all of a sudden it's just massive. But part of that is of course, the artificial nature of this recession. For the majority of the people who have been laid off, their experience is much closer to what a classic furlough would be than real unemployment. This is not a company that was in financial distress and has had to shut down because it's lost market share, all the different things that happen during a real recession. This is a company that was told to shut down, stop working, send everybody home, can't do anything, quit. Well, okay. What do I do with my employees? Well, send them home. Okay, for how long? Don't know, just do it. So it's kind of like what happens in the auto industry every summer when the plant shut down for retooling. The employees go on unemployment for a month or two while the plant is shut down. So they are technically unemployed. Really, they're on furlough. They're going to come back to work as soon as the plant opens back up. That's hopefully what we experience this time, is that, hey, we don't really want to fire you. We don't really have a reason to fire you. So as soon as things return to normal, we're going to bring you back. And that's going to hopefully be a bad little month or two within the course of the year, but you will be able to get back to normal behavior right after that. That's the idealistic scenario. If you look at the service sectors, list of things that we knew were going to be affected: breweries, bridal stores, breakfast and brunch places, day spas. For those of you who are seriously involved with supplying plumbing to yoga studios, they're not doing very well, and probably will have to wait a while to come back to life. But if you look at all of these, you'll see that the common theme is having the consumer go back to normal habits. If the consumer feels that this is something that has been taken care of, that they can go back to their normal behavior, they'll go back to things like yoga studios and day spas and massage therapies. But if they're spooked and really scared by the whole process, and they don't really trust the information coming out as far as the all clear, those may be very slow to recover. Those may be the kind of spending decisions where it's like, well, I kind of miss my massage therapy, but it's not a critical part of my life, so I'm not necessarily going to go back. It's interesting that financial advising is not experiencing the same decline, because people are still panicking about, what does this mean for my retirement? How does it affect what I've been trying to accumulate for my home or for sending a kid to school? They're sort of hanging in there, the others not so much. If you look at things like the hospitality sector, that's been hit really hard. This is year over years for the hotel business, and it's just awful. The hotels will also recover quickly once people resume their old habits. The hotels are highly dependent on either tourists, depending on where they are in the country, or they're dependent on the business community. If you look at how other parts of the world are bouncing back, the business community is coming back a little faster than tourists, for kind of obvious reasons. If you're a tourist, well, it's a choice. I mean, you can decide to go to Disney World or not. You can decide to do a vacation or not. And maybe we're going to do a lot more staycations this year. If your boss says, you are going to Buffalo to close that deal, or you don't work for me at all anymore, you go to Buffalo to close the deal. You may not want to. You may be worried about it. You may bring, 500 pounds of hand sanitizer with you, but it's not like you have a choice. You're going to get on a plane. You're going to go to Buffalo. You're going to check into a hotel and do what you're paid to do. And the business community is the one that has sort of rebounded as quickly as other sectors, because it doesn't really have a choice. If you look at the grocery impact, which I thought was kind of interesting, supermarket out of stock percentages, we're higher than most of the rest of the world. We've had more of an issue with being out of stock and not having what we expect, because the supply chain has been seriously impacted. The transportation sector is trying to keep up. The production sector is trying to keep up, but it has been tough. A lot of the production operations, as far as food is concerned, have been partially shut down. They have been affected by the closing orders to a degree, even though they're generally considered necessary. You've simply got issues of finding people to continue to work in the plants that are operating. So we're seeing interruptions around the country. Not generally. There are still many parts of the U.S. where the supply chain is perfectly healthy, but it's a lot more strained than has been in other countries. And this is something that may take a little while to completely recover from. Housing impact, something that certainly affects this industry a lot. You've got declines, at least as assessed by the architectural firms. So the average estimated April decline, 43%. So it's, again, a sector that will come back relatively quickly once the lockdown is lifted. But in the meantime, it's severe, and it's interrupted by also supply chain issues as well as demand. If you look at sort of industries in general, most of them are down. Advertising, education, finance. You've seen an increase in food, even though the supply chains are stretched. The demand for food is high. Healthcare is up for obvious reasons. The media is up. Pharma is up. Pretty much everything else is down. Transportation, it's in high demand, has been struggling with everything from finding drivers to having enough units to be able to handle the demand. The impact for individual companies has varied, but with every passing week, it becomes more of an issue. Just a reduction in sales and new orders showing up all the way across the board. Because even if your industry is not directly affected, the industry you're selling into is. And that's been the cascade effect. As you shut down one sector of the economy, it kind of burbles through and affects all the other sectors are in some way connected to that one. Oil prices have crashed. Oil obviously means a lot to this sector, and it's been kind of a double whammy. We've had both an oil war going on at the same time that demand has been affected by the COVID-19 crisis. Now, a lot of attention paid in the last couple of days to the deal that was made between the U.S. and the OPEC nations and Russia, but it's not nearly as big a deal as it seems to have been touted. This is something where you're dealing with a problem that has been in existence for many, many years that is not connected necessarily to COVID. When the U.S. began to develop its shale oil, the threat to the other oil producers in the world was immediate and obvious. And if you looked at everything that OPEC has done since then, including those non-OPEC nations like Russia that tend to work with OPEC, they knew this was an existential threat. They knew that the U.S. was now in a position to, number one, no longer have to import much oil from them, and number two, compete with them by selling oil to other countries around the world. Every step that they took for the last several years has been designed to blunt the impact of the U.S. oil business. They've cut prices before. They have increased production before. They have done everything they can to hang on to market share and try to find a way to limit the competition from the U.S. They seized this opportunity to really accelerate that process. They knew demand was going to be down. They could feel it. They could see it. It was happening because of COVID-19 and the shutdown. So if now was a stressful moment for oil anyway, they can pile on because they can make money at a much lower price per barrel than can American oil producers. The fracking process is not cheap. And in order for that to be profitable, you've got to have prices at least at $50 a barrel, and that's rock bottom. Preferably, if you talk to people in the sector, $70, $80, $90 a barrel would be a whole lot more comfortable. And this is the start level that encourages investment. So the hack was expected, it happened, and now we're just dealing with the demand issue, which is still bad. We don't have the demand that we've had in the past. If you look at the next, here's the challenge over the last dozens of decades. Going all the way back to the 1920s, oil was very stable, and then all of a sudden you have all of the ups and downs and the high levels and the low levels that start in the 1990s and into the 2000s. Right now, we're seeing a tremendous drop in terms of oil usage, and nobody is really making any money off it. So the deal that was signed was significant, kind of, but it only takes the production down to levels that are slightly higher than demand justifies. So even with that decision to reduce supply, there's still no demand. There is still no overwhelming desire on the part of users to buy more oil. Plus, you've got the situation of storage. There's a tremendous amount of oil that has been put in storage because of, again, the lack of demand. So the user is going to be able to access cheaper oil for a long period of time. Now, the per barrel price could possibly jump up a little bit just in response to this. The markets have reacted, but not very strongly. They're not that enthusiastic about what this means long term to the market. Global oil demand growth forecast for 2020, that is ridiculous. We have not seen a decline in demand that dramatic in decades. So getting not going to be easy. If we get this May rebound that we're hoping for, we can probably get back to levels that we saw maybe in February, maybe even in January, by midsummer to the end of summer. So this could be a relatively short period of limited oil demand. It'll fire up as soon as industry does, but it's going to have done some lasting damage in the meantime. A lot of the companies that are in oil in the U.S. are small, and they're not surviving this. The bigger ones, of course, will do fine. They'll probably snap up a lot of the smaller competitors that are now in trouble. So how do we end the lockdown recession? We'll sort of finish off with this. There are very likely to be a kind of a four-phase approach. Everybody that we have seen around the world, whether it's been Asia or Europe, they've all done a variation of this, where they're sort of referring to it as a soft recovery. It's not like one day all the rules change and everybody goes back to what they used to do. The first phase would be to open up other retailers. We've already got a situation where people can go to grocery stores and drugstores and hardware stores, and every state has had kind of a different interpretation of what is absolutely necessary. I mean, in my area, vape stores are still open, because God knows we need to make sure that young people cripple their lungs so that if they get COVID-19, they're in big trouble. That makes no sense to me at all. But in Michigan, they're now deciding that certain Walmarts and Targets and the like are not allowed to sell anything in their store that is not necessary. And the government has decided that toys are not necessary, garden supplies are not necessary. Really, I'm not quite sure what that is supposed to accomplish. The idea is that people won't be wandering around the store as much. Seriously, that logic escapes me. But that's supposedly phase one. Open up the stores, the people shop, let them go for clothes or furniture or whatever. The stores can maintain a certain amount of protection if they choose to. Phase two, opening up restaurants and service establishments. The idea here is that you still have a modicum of control in terms of perhaps how you seat people, what kind of hygiene you practice, how clean you keep the establishment, what sort of options people have. Phase three is opening up opportunities for conferences and meetings. Again, this is an idea where you've got control. If you're organizing a conference, you're in front of your population, you can tell them to do things like use hand sanitizer. You can tell them not to sit so close to each other. You can control, to a certain extent, their behavior. You can stay in hotels that have a high level of hygienic security. That's the theory, that you're at least in a position where you've got some control. The very last phase would be opening up large public gatherings, sporting events, concerts, things where you have uncontrolled crowds and people are going to be very close to one another and there's not much you can do about it. This whole process could take 3 months, 2 months, 1 month. It just kind of depends on how aggressive the reduction of these restrictions would be. There will almost undoubtedly be new protocol introduced, similarly to what we went through with the 9/11 attacks. We didn't have a TSA before 9/11. We didn't have airline security before 9/11. We didn't have a lot of this now. We were hit by a threat that we weren't expecting. We reacted by making sure we hoped this would never happen again. We're going to go through another period of this, only this time it'll be oriented towards health. There will be mandatory health checks of one kind or another, predominantly probably for people who are traveling or people over which we have a certain modicum of control. Again, if you look at what's happening in some of the Asian countries, some of the European countries, it can be something as simple as taking people's temperatures before they get on an airplane. If they're running a fever, they can't get on the airplane. If you take it to the next step, and you're seeing this in some parts of China and South Korea, you get your temperature taken as you come to work. If you show up at your office building and you're running a fever, go home. And lots of questionnaires. Where have you been? What are you doing? How do you feel? There will be continued efforts at social isolation. You will still have a push to keep people from being too close to each other. I don't know that the 6-foot barrier is going to be maintained, but there will be an attempt to discourage people from becoming too grouped up. Meetings might be taking place in larger facilities where people can spread out. Most importantly, there's going to be a huge emphasis on personal hygiene, personal health. People are going to be required to be diligent about things like washing their hands and using sanitizers and just being careful about their own lives. This has been the approach the Swedes took almost from the very beginning, and the Swedes never did shut down most of their society. Most things were left open, but the word was be ultra vigilant about your personal hygiene, and the Swedes are kind of more culturally oriented that way anyway, and that's exactly what they did. There was a lot more attention paid to personal responsibility. That will be something that will be largely enforced. The recovery depends on timing. Showed you this chart last time. We have the May reboot, the summertime V-shape, which means probably not rebooting until June, perhaps even July, and then a fall recovery. The majority of analysts still think that we're looking at a May, maybe June reboot, at least the way most of the businesses are gearing up and the way most of the government opportunities are being presented. We want to get out of this, and we want to get out of this within the next 3 to 4 weeks. Peak is supposed to be hitting next week for most states, so the majority of the states in the country will have hit their peak numbers by that time and will have started to decline, which may be a trigger to start opening things up again. 3 scenarios, and this is kind of an eye chart. I'm not going to go into this in great detail, but you can read it later. Quick recovery, you have public health response similar to that in China. The virus turns out to be seasonal. Its fatality ratio is near to that of flu. Change in behavior, kind of localized. The impact economically is a quick recovery. We're sort of back to normal by third quarter at least. Relatively fast rebound. The global slowdown, which is kind of in place now, means that the public health response is not quite as effective as it's been in China. The virus turns out to be seasonal, but the fatality rate's a little higher or close to that of flu. Recovery is nearly complete economically by third quarter, but there are still sectors that will be hurt throughout the summer. The Europe and the United States will be a little bit slower to come back. The global pandemic, which is kind of the worst of the outcomes, is based on the virus being not seasonal. It continues to be an issue through the year. It has much higher fatality levels. Most everything on that sort of miserable end has not come to pass. We have seen a lot more progress as far as the virus is concerned than even a week or two ago. One of the more important discoveries, for example, is that this is a very slow morphing virus. One of the things that makes flu so difficult to deal with is it changes so rapidly that you end up having to come up with a vaccine every year for whatever that strain is. So far, research seems to show that COVID-19 morphs about 5 to 6 times slower than the flu, which means that once you get a vaccine, and it's one that could last 4, 5, 6 years. Vaccines that are used for things like MERS and SARS last for multiple years, so you don't have to administer them over and over and over again. They tend to accumulate, and there's evidence that some of the things that are being used to control COVID-19 provide many, many years of protection, at least minimizing the way it affects the people who get infected. The most difficult questions, as I mentioned earlier, are coming. We can't eradicate COVID-19. We don't eradicate any of these viruses. They've been around for decades. They will be around for decades. This will not be the first time we've been hit by something like this. It will certainly not be the last. The questions that are going to have to be asked are very tough. How many infections can be tolerated? How many fatalities? How sick can people be allowed to get? As I mentioned last time, the CDC estimates an annual flu burden every year. For 2019, the estimate was between 9 million and 45 million illnesses, between 140,000, 800,000 hospitalizations, etc. The toll from COVID-19 so far has been far less than that. And at some point, there's going to have to be a declaration that says this is the best we're going to do. We are going to continue to see COVID-19 infections. There will continue to be people who are going to get ill. There are continuing hospitalizations. We're still going to see fatalities. This is not going to go away. If we get to a point where we have a modicum of control and we have some sense of who really is vulnerable and how we can control the outbreak, we're going to sort of let society go back to normal. The big changes that will occur in years to come will be based on treatment, testing, and vaccines. Once there's a vaccine, then the whole equation changes quite significantly because now there are things people can do to protect themselves. But that does not mean that we will not be hit by yet another virus we don't understand today. The other issue is going to be testing. Who has it and what can be done to keep them from spreading it, and then the whole issue of treatment. If the vast majority of people get a mild version of this, and even the ones who are hospitalized are assured of recovery, then this becomes a problem, but not a crisis. It becomes a burden to the healthcare system because they're going to have to find ways to treat people coming in to the system. But if the treatment protocols are more effective, then it becomes like many other diseases that we deal with, where you cope with it, but you don't shut society down. I throw this in here just because it's fascinating. The things that are selling and the things that aren't. There has been a massive increase in demand for disposable gloves and bread machines. Really. Again, there are certain things that baffle me. Toilet paper is way up there. A little more demand for that, but demand for soup and increased demand for fruit cups. Who knew? A massive increase in demand for weights. Apparently, people have decided that if they're going to be stuck at home, they're at least going to be stuck at home in a buff condition. Fitness goods in general are up. Dog food is up, pain reliever. And then there are all the things that are seriously down. Luggage. If you can't travel, why buy luggage? Briefcases are down because apparently we no longer have to do anything at work, so we can just work from home. And who needs a briefcase to go from your bedroom to your den? Men's swimwear and women's swimwear are down, so during periods of isolation, we apparently don't swim. There's been a serious decline in party and event supplies. That makes sense. But a decline in drones, that's confusing. Why would you not want a drone right now? I mean, that may be your only exposure to the outside world, is at least you can cruise your neighborhood and see who else is out there. Golf clubs are down. I'm not sure about that, though, because every time I drive by my local golf course, it seems to be well populated. So I think people have decided that, the way they play golf, they're socially distanced from their compatriots anyway. So I leave you with this observation. This is Sue. Sue is 31. She's been homeschooling for the last week. I have noticed an awful lot of very stressed people. I'm doing a lot more Zoom meetings, and it's been interesting to watch the metamorphosis because in the beginning, people were trying to sort of maintain an image in these Zoom meetings. They were still kind of clothed properly, and they were combing their hair and all this sort of stuff. With every passing day, it's like people are living in a yurt. It's like the sweatshirt's got gravy stains on it. They haven't really combed their hair in a week, and they're looking very haggard. And in a couple of cases, I've seen kids in the background that are very likely going to be traded for something in the not distant future. And then toilet paper, that's become the new currency. that, I'm going to hush, and Aisha's going to start firing some questions my way. And those of you who want more of this, feel free to subscribe to the Business Intelligence Brief. It's free, and it has turned into the Plague Report. That's almost all I seem to write about anymore. So, take it away, Aisha.
Got it. Well, I'm beginning to resemble Sue as well,
That's right.
I'm getting there. And you know what? There is no yeast to be found in the market.
No.
So people are actually making bread. Yes.
No,
yes.
They are. I mean, it's crazy. It's like, it's all of a sudden, I think the thing that apparently there's been some message sent that if you want to be protected from COVID-19, it's homemade bread, toilet paper, and hand sanitizer, just like a fort. And then you're.
Yep. Well, anyways, thank you for another great webinar, and you shared some wonderful info with us, really insightful. I'm going to ask the attendees to start posting their questions in the question box now. Also, please remember to fill the satisfaction survey after and let us know if we should have another webinar in a few weeks. We would want to know from you. So now I'm waiting for questions, and I have one right now. Will warmer weather help with a quicker recovery in terms of housing bills, construction projects in general?
Yeah, I think you'll probably see the usual response that we get in the spring of the year being pushed more into the summer. So timing actually may be working in our benefit for the next couple of months, because travel will come back and people's desire to sort of go out and interact will return. Housing will increase. Anything that is normally connected to warmer weather. Now, we saw almost all of that delayed as far as spring is concerned, because we would have expected to see movement in any of those sectors as early as March and April. And of course, that's all been placed on hold. Most of that has been pushed off. It has been canceled as much as it has been delayed. So I expect to see more travel in July and August than maybe would normally be the case, more attendance at events should they be opened up again, and more construction. It'll depend on timing. It'll depend on whether or not we reopen significantly by June or July. But even in terms of the associations that I work with, most of them not outright cancel their meetings. They pushed it off until July or August, trying to maintain the meeting, but recognizing the shutdown.
Okay, another question. The $350 bill passed for payroll protection to small employers will be depleted soon, reports are saying. What becomes of all the unprocessed loan applications, would you say? Only a delay or out of luck to get a PPP loan?
It kind of depends on what Congress decides to do, because there's a lot of conversation now about adding another $1 trillion to this original plan. I don't know where that stands as far as Congress is concerned. There are certainly those that want to do that. There are certainly those that oppose adding more to the debt. The anticipated demand was far exceeded. You had an awful lot more businesses applying, and frankly, the economists were warning at the time that, this is inadequate. So my guess be that if you are not seeing a reopening of the economy within the next 3 weeks to a month, there's probably going to be another round of stimulus. Now, if the decision is made to start reopening the economy, the perception then will be, well, these companies don't need it anymore. They're businesses that can start up again, so they're not going to have the help. Then it'll be a matter of the companies coming back and saying, that's not true. Even if we open up, we have lost so much money in the last 2 months that we're not going to be able to make that up, even if we work very hard for the rest of the year. So that's kind of an open conversation. My guess is the pressure on Congress is going to be pretty immense to add more money to this. And to be frank, if you've already borrowed $2 trillion, might as well borrow and just keep throwing money at it until the situation is corrected, because you're already down the rabbit hole. There's not a lot of point to to stop short of success.
Okay, another one is for our industrial PVF listeners. Do you feel oil and gas situation is deteriorating?
Yeah, oil and gas is not in good shape right now because it's been affected by demand. But like everything else, if the demand comes back, those sectors will come back right along with it. The challenge, I think, going forward is whether or not the blow that was struck to the U.S. oil sector by the Saudis and OPEC and Russia is serious enough to compromise growth in that area. We are still in a position of producing relatively expensive oil. And if the demand does not return strongly, and if the OPEC nations decide to reverse course again and start putting pressure on prices, it's going to have an impact on the U.S. sector. Two things have to happen, obviously. Demand has to come back, and our competitors have to resist the temptation to relaunch the oil war.
Right. So another one is, will the recovery be state to state? And if yes, would you see a quicker out of gates recovery?
Yeah, it definitely will be state to state because you've got very different approaches to putting business back to work. And you also had states that have been hit a lot harder than others. Generally speaking, the Midwest has been unaffected in a very real sense. You have a large number of counties, a large number of states that have been very, very minor impact as far as COVID-19. It's mostly been in the cities. So those sectors will come back relatively fast. You'll also see states, for example, New York and Massachusetts, that are going to be slower to come back out of it because they were hit harder by the infection. California is sort of in the middle because they reacted pretty quickly with social isolation, but they've also been affected by a large population of victims of COVID-19. You are probably going to see three different categories of states. You're going to have states that really weren't affected at all and are going to come back very quickly, maybe even by the end of May. You'll have others that are going to be coming right on top of them because their impact was predominantly in their urban areas, not in the rural areas. For example, in where I live, Kansas has been almost completely unaffected except Kansas City. Kansas City will be slow because it's the urban area, and it's the one that was most affected. Missouri has gotten more of an impact because it has two large urban areas, as Kansas City and St. Louis. The rural parts of the area have been virtually unaffected. So they'll come back, but those are also the smaller population sectors of both of those states.
Okay, and I think there's another question somewhat similar to it. It is, can you describe how soon you expect market recoveries will occur by geography, Midwest, South, East Coast, etc.?
Yeah, I think probably your first recoveries would be Midwest, mountain states, because they've been hit least hard. Southwest probably would be in third place, again, with the exception of the more concentrated urban areas, and recognizing that the Southwest has a larger population of older residents. Southeast probably comes in next. The slowest would be Northwest and Northeast, mostly because of population dynamics, when the virus began to appear there, and just simply the fact that you've got a higher concentration of people, and these are also areas that are more dependent on travel and tourism than other parts of the country.
Got it. Another one is, do you estimate another downturn in the stock market once companies start providing their first quarter financials and second and third quarter estimates?
Yeah, you'll probably see a reaction, but it will be a little bit less dramatic than it might have been because everybody is expecting bad news. The markets don't generally respond to something dramatically unless they're not expecting it. And when you saw the number of companies that weren't even offering guidance this time, the markets just kind of said, well, yeah, everyone's going to get clobbered. What's the surprise? We know they're all going to be bad. They're going to be looking for a company that does better than expected, or they're going to be looking for one that is way worse than expected. But for the most part, they've all just kind of buttoned down and said, yeah, it's going to be bad. We we knew it's going to be bad, so we've already reacted.
Got it. Another one is, in an early slide, it was indicated that 4% of the cases were more than minor. Is there a breakdown of the 4% into hospital, ICU, ventilator, etc.? Useful to know what the true serious rate per 100,000 could be.
Yeah, it's hard to really determine because there's been a certain amount of difference as to how hospitals have reported the cases. And there's been one of, like New York went through this in the middle of February, where they suddenly had this huge spike in cases because things that had not been assigned to COVID-19 were, and suddenly you had thousands more people that were affected by COVID-19. The disease is a tricky one in the sense that it opens you up to all kinds of other attacks. People who are being in serious, they're dying of pneumonia, they're dying of respiratory illnesses. So it's been hard to actually get uniform data. You're still kind of looking at apples versus oranges. What is being termed serious is somebody who is hospitalized for more than a day, suffering from some kind of upper respiratory ailment, which is likely COVID-19 related, not guaranteed. Could be a different strain of flu, it could be something else entirely. But to be on the kind of safe side, they're deciding anything respiratory is will be COVID-19 related. And then deciding whether it's serious or not is depending entirely on length of hospitalization. People who are in for a day basically are like, nope, that's not serious. You got treatment, you're now recovering at home, don't worry about it. And you still have a vast number of people, which is part of the problem, 60-some%, who are asymptomatic. They have it, but they don't show any symptom at all, but they're still spreading it.
Okay. Another one is, when could we see numbers, worldwide deaths affected by COVID-19 on an annualized basis?
Probably the prediction for peak globally is mid to late summer, because we peaked in Asia, we peaked in Europe. Most of the European states are now on the downhill side. We are supposed to peak in another week or two. That means that we'll be looking at Latin America, Africa, South Asia. The Indians think they have already hit peak. They're starting to reopen business again. So we're probably talking June or July for a global peak, but that's going to be hard to quantify because we're now getting into parts of the world where data collection is just awful. How are we going to know what's happening in Africa? That'd be a challenge.
Another one is, how will air travel and mass transit be permanently affected by social distancing?
What's that again?
How will mass air travel and mass transit be permanently affected by social distancing?
Yeah, it depends on really how the industries react, because one of the realities is that if you are dealing with how to keep a particular entity safe, an airplane is considerably easier to treat hygienically than a grocery store. Right now we're allowed to go to grocery stores. We can go to drugstores. Well, everybody and their brother is wandering in and out of the grocery store, and the kids are touching everything, and people are touching everything, and you have no idea who's coming in. You can't sanitize it. An airplane you can sanitize. It's a distinct spot, and it's going to be time-consuming and probably expensive, but it's possible. Going forward, it's been basically pointed out that one of the safest places you can be is a cruise ship, because they're going to completely clean it from stem to stern and then isolate it from everything. It'll be out to sea. So I think travel will probably return, because it's going to be one of the spheres that is relatively easy to treat. The harder thing is going to be when you have no control. That's why the concert sporting event thing. You pack 80,000 people in to see a football game. Holy cow! It's just there's no way to escape. your fellow fans, and they're all
Oh, yeah.
yelling, spitting, and it's just like,
Yeah.
at least in an airplane, we're sitting there very obediently scrubbing our table with wipes, and or even before all this started, I sat next to a guy that had completely wrapped himself in a black plastic bag. So I guess that's an option too.
Okay, we have quite a few more questions. When do you believe business will return to normal, or will it become a new normal, and when do you expect that to happen?
Yeah, I think we'll go back fairly close to where we were before, because this has not yet been a life-altering situation for long enough to let us forget about what life used to be. But there will be certain changes. I think the way we work will change a little. There's going to be a little more willingness to work from home. There's going to be a little less desire for constant contact with our fellow, which, for a lot of people, it's like this is an ideal situation for introverts, let's put it that way. The new normal will also probably involve a lot less travel for no apparent reason, but I think you'll still see a lot of attendance. I mean, I look at some of the conferences that I'm supposed to speak at. People have no choice but to attend these. I mean, it's the biggest thing in their industry. This is where they do all their business.
Right.
This is where they meet all their contacts. They can't not go.
Right. Exactly. Okay, another one. How will all the stimulus money being injected into the economy impact inflation in future years?
Yeah, it's going to have an impact on inflation, but probably not right away, because a lot of the things that would normally drive inflation, like higher oil prices and higher commodity prices in general, those may not appear until much later in the year. There's a lot of money being injected, but it's being injected on top of a serious loss. So even though the government's throwing a lot of money, $2 trillion plus into the economy, it's replacing the money that people would have made if they were continuing to work. So it's not like the consumer has more money. They just got it from a different source. The real issue from a kind of an inflation damaging perspective is that the government debt is going to be back up to where it was prior to 2015, 2016. We're going to be back to the 2008, 2009 situation where the Fed was carrying a $6 to some $7 trillion balance sheet.
Wow. Okay, are there statistics on businesses that have already permanently closed, or if the misery continues for another month, will close permanently? I worry about the ripple effect and AR implications. I think AR might be accounts receivable. Your thoughts?
Yeah, definitely, because you do have a lot of businesses that are not going to survive, and they tend to be smaller. And unfortunately, this is one of those events that's crippled companies and pushes them over the edge. J.C. Penney just announced that it's going into bankruptcy. Well, that's not a big shock. They've been teetering on the edge of it now for 2 years, but this was the final straw, pushing them over the edge. Eventually, the market that those businesses served remains, and there will be a new business that comes along and replaces the one that went out of business if it's still a viable way to make money. But it doesn't do the original business any favors to know that, oh, hey, there'll be a new competitor picking up on market share later. This is going to be one of those business case studies in the future where people say, you need to have a contingency plan for everything. Companies that were weak going into this circumstance have been rendered highly vulnerable. And as a result, they will go out of business, stay out of business, but the business that they were in will probably continue, and a new business will come along to pick up where they left off.
Okay. Do you believe this event will have any long-term impact on the U.S. housing market and demographic preference of housing choices?
It's hard to say at this point, but you're hearing some really interesting anecdotal stuff. Was talking to some real estate people at a conference too, and they said that right now it's hard to tell what's going on because people are not in the mood to buy homes. But they were saying, up until this event, we weren't getting a lot of interest in single family homes on the part of millennials. Millennials are like, nope, I like apartments and I like lofts and I don't want to do this. Almost every one of them was reporting my millennials have a whole different approach now. They're all saying, nope, I want my own home. I don't want to be living next to a bunch of other people. And the other issue, and I've been hearing this a lot from the remodelers, is that people are now looking at their home very differently and saying, well, if I'm going to be working from home a lot, I need to have a section of my home set up for that. If I'm going to be spending a lot more time in my own space, it's not as efficient as I thought it was. I was used to going out and, now I can't as much. So there may be changes in how people design homes. Hard to tell right now. It's so new, but that's kind of the conversation that I'm hearing from the home builders and the remodel.
Okay. In your opinion, is the 4-phase lockdown reopening that you describe a generally accepted game plan?
It is the most common of the discussions right now. You're seeing more of that in Europe, but it's not the only one. The other one that's been discussed with opening up sectors of the country and keeping other sectors shut down. So the idea would be that the Midwest, which hasn't had as much of an impact, would be opened up for New York and areas that were unaffected. The challenge and the fear is that if you do that, people who are in the affected areas will move to the unaffected areas and end up spreading the virus that way. So I don't know that there are going to be hordes of people from New York wanting to live in, Dodge City, Kansas, but, I suspect not. But there might be some, and it's like, oh no, all of a sudden people from Brooklyn who have COVID-19 moving to Dodge City, and it becomes a problem there. Most of the Europeans are in a phased thing, but there are exceptions. I mean, Sweden never really went into lockdown. Austria opened everything up at once. I mean, they weren't going to do phases at all.
Got it. How do we best focus our business planning for 2021 should this come around again next year?
Yeah, if we are looking at a repeat, we are unlikely to get the same kind of response that we got this year, because the conversation going forward will be, how do we make sure we test adequately? There's no reason we can't have a much more robust testing sector. How do we make sure that the hospitals are able to handle the demand? Germany, for example, has been out of this with relatively less damage because they had a surplus of hospital beds. They were actually talking last year about trying to reduce the number of hospital beds they had because they felt it was oversupply. Now they're like, hey, it's a good thing we have these. We will, between now and next year, do a lot more testing protocols. We'll be doing a lot more preparing in the medical center for an outbreak like this, so that if there is another outbreak, whether it's COVID-19 or something else, there will be a purely medical response, which will not also include an economic response. It'll be something along the lines of what you've seen. Well, you look at places like South Korea and Singapore dealing with SARS, where they once had to do this major shutdown, but now it was test for SARS. If you have a problem, get it dealt with medically. We're not shutting down the economy. And that's kind of the direction we're going, I think, for next year.
Right. Another one, does the PPP program have a need requirement?
I don't know the specific details. It has been a little bit hard to keep up with. The legislation was lengthy, it was about 900 pages long, and I have heard several different interpretations from people who were right back in the middle of this process. My recommendation has been to find an accountant who has had some experience with this or is delving into this in some detail, because from those that I've talked to, they said, man, we have had to devote a lot of man hours to understanding how this works. The banks are also struggling to figure out what all the details are because they're ultimately on the hook, but they don't quite know what the rules are for them either. So definitely find an accountant, lawyer, banker that's been up to their eyebrows in this because they're going to know the details.
Right. And we actually, on our ASA website, have put up a coronavirus resource center, and we have a ton of great information on that. We did this, our CFO did this interview with Gene Marks, who's talking about SBA loans best practices. And there's a lot of other stuff out there. So you can get your answers to some of these questions, especially these loan-related questions, loan forgiveness, and all of that. So please go there and check that out. And, we're out of questions. The last one is just a comment asking me to speak slower, so I will try to do that next time.
Very good. There's so much information to impart, it's hard. So, well, if we do have round 4 of this, I hope it is a much more upbeat, yay, we're all back. And
I know, right?
It's very important, particularly being from Kansas City. It is very important that we're through with this by the time football season starts. I mean, come on. We waited 50 years to be Super Bowl champions. We don't want to mess it up now.
For you. I feel for you. It might be virtual, though.
We'll see.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Chris, for a great webinar. It's been it's been a wonderful 3 weeks. I've truly enjoyed all these webinars, and we've learned a lot. And I thank you on behalf of all the members as well. And when I send out the survey, please fill it out and send me back the responses. I will analyze the survey, and I will send you the results in a day.
And I look forward to seeing everybody in Palm Springs and someday soon.
I know. Same here. Palm Springs sounds really nice. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.